Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Daled, and Mirz Hashem, today we will be learning Daf Reish Lamed Amid Aleph. We are continuing to learn Lahalachas of HaTorah. We pick up today on Reish Chav Tes Amid Beis, Siman Shin Samach Vav, Sif Beis, 3 lines down in the Shulchan Aruch. Our learning today should be Yischus for Achenu Kabeis Yisrael, Hanusunim Batzara Ubashivya, Ha'imdim Bein Bayom Ubein Bayabasha, Hamakim Yerachim Alehem, V'yotziei Mitzar L'Rvacha Me'afelu La'oira B'shibud L'Geula, Hashta B'Agala V'Zman Kariv V'Nemar Mein. Our learning should be Yischus for Refuah Shalema, for Moiri Rabbi Reb Shalom Ruvain Ben Shema, for Achya Gadol Moshe Ben Esther Fradel, Yitzchak Ben Sia Medusha, Rivka Bashir Leah, Chava Hadassah Bas Rezel Serel, Yeshua Levi Ben Ahuva Malkachana. They should all have a Refuah Shalema B'Seich Shar Chole Yisrael. Okay, now, we began learning the halachas of Eruv Chatzeros. Now, it's critically important, as we travel through the halachas of Eruv Chatzeros, to remember what the underpinning of Eruv Chatzeros is. The problem that, the reason why Shlomo HaMelech made a takana requiring Eruv Chatzeros is because when you have multiple dwellings inside a chatzer, there is a difference between each individual house. Each individual house is an individual Rishos HaYachid that belongs to one person, belongs to one entity, and then there's the Chatzer. The Chatzer is also a Rishos HaYachid. It's Mukaf Mechitzais. That's always the assumption when we deal with a Chatzer. We always assume that we're dealing with a Chatzer that is Mukaf Mechitzais. So the house is a Rishos HaYachid, the Chatzer is a Rishos HaYachid. But they're two different flavors of Rishos HaYachid. And therefore, there was a fear that if we're going to allow people to transfer from the house to the chasser, from the chasser to the house, or even from one house to another house in the chasser, that is going to be confused with transferring from a Rishos HaYachid to a Rishos HaRabim. People might chas v'chalila come to the Isser Daraisa. So, to head that off, Shlomo HaMelech was misakin, an Isser Darabanan. You're not allowed to transfer from a house in a chasser to the chotzer, from the chotzer to the house, from one house to another house in the chotzer, without making an eruv chatzeros. What does an eruv chatzeros do? By making an eruv chatzeros, it joins all of the individual homeowners into one entity. Now, they all live, so to speak, in one place, in one house. Here we get again into the differences between the Rishonim. Either everybody is seen to be living in the house where the pas of the Erev is, or because they all joined in the pas of the Erev in one house, that joins them wherever they are. They're all considered to be one entity now. But now, in a way, through the mechanics of Eruv Chatzeros, we've now created a situation where we don't see the bottom and the Chatzeros as being such different flavors. Now we're no longer afraid people are going to become confused and end up transferring from Rishos HaYachid to Rishos HaRabim, from Rishos HaRabim to Rishos HaYachid. Now, before we go weiter, there's one thing that I want to point out that I did not mention in yesterday's share, and that is, if you do not make an Eruv Chatzeros, so you're not allowed to transfer from a house in the chotzer to the chotzer. You're not allowed to transfer from the chotzer to the house. You're not allowed to transfer from one house to another house. You are allowed to carry inside the chotzer kelim sheshavsu b'chotzer. So if you have a keli that started off Shabbos in the chotzer, then even if you don't have an eruv chatzeros, you're allowed to move that chayfetz around even more than Daled Amos in the chotzer. So I mentioned yesterday, if you have a lawn chair, and the lawn chair is sitting outside in the chotzer, and you didn't make it a Eruv Chatzeros, on Shabbos you're allowed to move the lawn chair from one end of the chotzer to the other end of the chotzer. But if the lawn chair started off Shabbos in the garage, so the lawn chair was in the house, it was in the bayis, now you cannot transfer it from the bayis to the chotzer. But the point that I did not mention yesterday, that I want to mention right now, is something that the Chavetz Chaim says in the Sharet Zion, in Sharet Zion Ois Cotton Aleph. He points out that when we say that without an Eruv Chatzeros, you're not allowed to transfer from one house to another house inside the chotzer, that's not only if you transfer from one house to another house derech ha-chotzer. Not only is it usher to take something out of unit number 1, carry it through the chutzner, and then transfer it to unit number 2? More than that. Let's say you have bungalows in this bungalow colony that are semi-attached. So unit number 1 and unit number 2 are in the same building. It's a 2-family bungalow. And let's say there's a door inside connecting unit number 1 to unit number 2. So that theoretically you could transfer something from unit number 1 to unit number 2 without ever going through the chutzner. That would also be usher if you don't have an eruv chatzeros. Any transference from one bias in the chutzner to another bias in the chutzner is usher unless you have an eruv chatzeros. I did not mention that yesterday. I wanted to make sure that we mentioned it today. Now, as we go into Sif Beis, the critical thing to remember is, like I said, the underpinning of the takana of eruv chatzeros is that you have a chutzner and you have 2 entities living in the chutzner. You have 2 batim of Yisraelim. You have 2 homes belonging to Yidden. So you have Reuven lives in one house in the chutzner, Shimon lives in another house of the chutzner. That's when we start to have problems. That's when the halacha of eruv chatzeros applies, because you have 2 individual homeowners and they're together in one chutzner. Now, against that backdrop, we could understand that the whole halacha of eruv chatzeros is only going to kick in if you have 2 people living in 2 different homes. But if you have one person living in a house, and let's say you have another person who does not have a house in the chutzner, he lives in the chutzner, he has a little homeless encampment inside the chutzner, then you don't have the halacha of eruv chatzeros. Then we don't have 2 diurim. We don't have 2 habitats inside the chutzner. We don't have 2 homes. We have 2 residents, but only one lives in a home. One lives in a home, the other one lives in the chutzner. In that case, we don't need an eruv chatzeros. And now we're going to have another manifestation of that halacha. Says the Mechaber Sif Beis, 3 lines off the bottom, Reish Chav Tes Amud Beis. Yoshvei oiholim oisukos. People who live in tents, or in sukkos, meaning huts. Oy machane shekifu mechitza. You have some kind of an encampment of tents, of huts, and it's surrounded by a mechitza. So now, let's think about this one for a second. You have an area that's surrounded by halachic mechitzos that are at least 10 tefachim tall. All right, what does that make? That makes a chutzner. You have an area surrounded by mechitzos. In the mechitza, you have people that are living in tents. All right, so let's say you have 20 tents with 20 families living inside this chutzner. All right, so you've got a chutzner and you've got 20 diurim. You have 20 tents. Each one is a different entity. Says the Mechaber, in such a case, you do need an eruv chatzeros. Ein metaltalin me oihel la oihel. You would not be allowed to transfer from one tent to the other tent. And the Mishnah Berurah is going to say you also wouldn't be allowed to transfer from the tent to the chutzner. Says the Mechaber, ad sheyar v'kulam, until they make it eruv chatzeros. So what's the halacha that the Mechaber just told me? You should know, if you have a chutzner, and instead of having 21 bungalows inside the chutzner, instead of having 21 houses inside the chutzner, you have 21 tents inside the chutzner, you still need an eruv chatzeros. Now, before we even go to the Mishnah Berurah, let's take a look at a biur halacha. So you have a long biur halacha here, biur halacha dibra maschil aval shayara, that begins on Reish Chav Tes Amud Beis and it ends on Reish Lamed Amud Aleph. Don't get scared. We're not going through this whole biur halacha. But if you go to Reish Chav Tes Amud Beis and you go to the very bottom line of the biur halacha, at least that's how it is in my print. I use the Ois V'Hadar Mishnah Berurah. I see it's the same way in the Dirshu Mishnah Berurah. The bottom line of the biur halacha on Reish Chav Tes Amud Beis says the Chavetz Chaim. La'anias daiti nira, in my humble opinion, not so humble, in my humble opinion, says the Chavetz Chaim, nira, it would appear, shemachvarta de milsa, that the clarity of this topic lies Kemoisha Pirashtu by Mishnah Berurah, the way I explain it in the Mishnah Berurah, which I didn't read it to you yet, because I think it's kedai to see the Biur Halacha first. The Biur Halacha spells it out very clearly. The machane, when the Mechaber talks here about a machane, about an encampment, Pirushoi, the explanation of the Mechaber is, Masha anu kairin baloshan Ashkenazi, lager, what we call in Yiddish a lager, a camp. We're not talking about, let's say, a troop of soldiers that are on the move. And right now they're setting up camp over here, and then tomorrow they're going to uproot and they're going to locate their camp somewhere else. No, that's not what we're talking about. Rak Mayri Shechainin b'Mokaim, they're encamped with a kvius in one place. Ella she'einin chainin b'Botim, Rak al Pnei Hasadeh. This is a permanent encampment, or at least a semi-permanent encampment. This is a bunch of people, I don't know why, but in my mind, what's coming to my mind is a trailer camp. We think about trailers as being a diras arai. We don't think about a trailer as being a house. A trailer is kind of a temporary dwelling, right? But there are trailer camps. There are trailer camps where people set up their trailers, they take the wheels off, they build them onto cinder blocks, and you have a trailer camp, and people live in these trailers, and the trailers never move for years. Says the Chavetz Chaim here in the Biur Halacha, this halacha of Siv Beis is talking about an encampment where people are living in tents, but they're not on the move. It's an encampment of tents, but they're staying there, and they're living in tents. Kemoishe Yadua, like the Chavetz Chaim says, like it is well known, Shahachayoloi Shel Melech, the troops of soldiers of the king, Chainin Bakayitz al Pnei Hasadeh. For the entire summer, they camp out al Pnei Hasadeh. They find a nice bika, they find a nice big field, and they set up camp. And the camp is going to remain there for the entirety of the summer. Rak Shem Amidin Kemoi Oholim. But they don't go build houses, they live in tents. But they're not on the move. Those tents are going to stay there for an extended period of time. Va'ashmi'inon, and the Mechaber is telling me a chiddush. Va'ashmi'inon, the Mechaber is coming to tell me, the gam oiholim shel arai ka'elu, even though these are tents and not houses, and a tent by definition is a diras arai. Now, it happens to be that they're going to live in this diras arai for the entire summer, they're never going to move. But a tent by definition is a diras arai. Vashmi'inon, the Mechaber is teaching me, the gam oiholim shel arai ka'elu, even tents like this, which by definition are diras arai, gam kein b'klal batim hema, they are considered houses in the context of the halachas of Iruv Chatzeros, v'shaych b'hu gzeres haitzah merishus l'rishus. And this gzera, that you're not allowed to transfer from one rishus to another rishus in the Chatzer without an Eruv Chatzeros, does apply. The Cholzeh b'ke'ein mashet tziyarti, but that only applies to the situation that I'm telling you. Dal kol panim chaynim b'kvius. When does this halacha of the Mechaber apply? When it is, like I said, at least a semi-permanent encampment. They're going to stay here for the entire summer. So it's not that they're on the move. Aval loy b'holchim b'derech. But this halacha, at least according to the Mechaber, does not apply if the people are on the move. If they're not going to stay there for an extended amount of time, then there is no gzera to necessitate in a Eruv Chatzeros. Okay, so we have over here a halacha in the Mechaber. The Mechaber says you should know, people made mechitzos, so they created a chutzner. They put up tents, which are inherently considered a diras arai. They put up tents inside this chutzner. But the tents are at least semi-permanent. They're going to stay there for an extended amount of time. The Mechaber tells us a chiddush. You might think that the halacha of Eruv Chatzeros doesn't apply. Why? Because like I told you at the beginning of this year, the whole underpinning of the halacha of Eruv Chatzeros is that you have a chutzner, and it's serving multiple diurin, habitats, homes, where people live. You might think, oihalim, those are diras arai. They don't meet the bar of being diurin. So maybe the halacha of Iruv Chatzeris doesn't kick in. Kamash Balad Mechaber. Since they're going to be living in these Ayholim for an extended period of time, and they're not moving them around, that constitutes multiple diurim, and therefore they do require Iruv Chatzeros. Now let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Cotton Hay. Yoshvei Ayholim. Keep going. For example, Sheichne Midbari Yois V'chadoime. People that live out in the wild. An encampment of, let's say, a troop of soldiers, out on the open field, that we call in Yiddish, we call it a lager. And the Chavetz Chaim sends you to the Bir Halacha that I read to you. This encampment was surrounded by halachic mechitzas. What the Mechaber wants to say is, you had a proper halachic mechitza of 10 tfachim in height. This encampment was surrounded by proper halachic mechitzas that are at least 10 tfachim tall. In such a case, you're not allowed to transfer from one oil to another oil. You're also not allowed to transfer between the tents, between the Ayholim and the Chatzar, without an Iruv Chatzeros. What's the Chatzar? The Chatzar is the area surrounded by the Mechitzais, Ois Cotton Tess, Ad Sheyarvu, until they make a proper Iruv Chatzeros. Why do we need a Iruv Chatzeros? Like we described yesterday in Sef Aleph, the Takana of Shlomo HaMelech. Now let's go weiter. Now the Mechaber is going to tell us a case where you do not need Iruv Chatzeros, because we do not see multiple diurin inside this Chatzar. Says the Mechaber, the bottom line, Reish Chav Tesam Beis, Aval Shayara, but a caravan, people that are actually on the move, people that are traveling. Aval Shayara Shehikifua Mechitza, if you have a traveling caravan, and they stopped. Maybe they stopped for a day. Maybe they stopped for 2 days. But they did not stop for an extended amount of time. They're not being kavea themselves in one makom. They stopped and they surrounded their area with a mechitza. Aval Shayara, caravan, says the Mechaber, she'ekifua mechitza, that was surrounded with mechitzas, ain't tzrichim la'arev. They do not need to make an Iruv Chatzeros. Why? Lefi shekulam me'uravim, because they are considered to be all intermingled. They're not considered to have multiple distinct diurim. Ve'ein oisam ayhalim kivuim lahem, because the tents that they're living in, they don't have the status of a diras kva. It's not considered, when you have a caravan that's constantly on the move, and they set up camp for a day. So each person pitched his tent for a day. They surrounded the area by a mechitza. When we look at this with halachic eyes, we do not see 20 distinct homes. Instead, what we see is one unified encampment of people that are on the move. And therefore, the halacha of Iruv Chatzeros does not kick in. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Yud, 2 lines off the bottom, Reish Chav Tesam Beis, Aval Shayara, a caravan, Archas Anoshim HaHolchos Derech Midbar, a group of people that are traveling through the wilderness. Doesn't mean that this is a requirement of this halacha that it has to be a midbar. That's not what it means. Point is, that's what caravans usually did. They got together in a group to travel through a wild area, so they needed a group to travel. There weren't one person getting into a wagon and traveling. They surrounded their caravan with mechitzas. And they do have individual tents. Each person pitched his own individual tent inside this encampment. Then you do not need an Iruv Chatzeros, Ois Katan Yud Beis, Lefisha Kulam, because they're all considered to be intermingled. Pirish, the Kevad She'ein Oisam Ayhalim Kivuem Lehem Ladira, because since these individual tents are not set up to be a Diras Kva, it's not, I set up home. No, I didn't set up home. I took Dalaramas and I set up a tent. I don't mean to be specific about the size. I need a shelter. I need a basic shelter, but I'm not setting up home. Rak derech arai, b'shasha oimdim lafush. They're stopping to rest for a little while. Mamida my holim. They put up tents. They put up basic shelters. Loi mikri chilik dirois. Very important phrase. Just to knock this into our heads. The Mishnah Berurah says, Loi mikri chiluk dirois. This is not considered now separate, distinct homes, separate, distinct diras that are being served by one chotzer. It's as if they're all a mishkababel. They're all living together in an encampment. The ayin b'biur halacha, where he spells it out in greater detail. Now, very interesting, this Mishnah Berurah now. The Mishnah Berurah brings down a biur hagra that totally disagrees with this mechaber. The mechaber just now told me two halachas. He told me one case where you do need eruv chatzeros. What was that halacha? A machane, an encampment of oiholim, where people are going to stay for an extended period of time. Chiluk diurin, it's considered different entities, different homes. You need eruv chatzeros. Shayara, a caravan on the move, you do not need eruv chatzeros. They're not considered separate diurin. The Mishnah Berurah brings down a biur hagra, shehevi b'fei mefarshim, who brings down in the name of mefarshim, shechol kamalzeh, who totally disagree with this mechaber. The daitam, and their opinion is actually the opposite. The oihalim shebeshayara tzrichem eruv, a traveling caravan, those tents, they do need eruv chatzeros. V'sheba machaneh, but if you have a machaneh, peturim eruv, then you don't need an eruv chatzeros. Ach, shayara lo mikri rakishu pachas me'asara. But the shayara that needs eruv chatzeros is only if it's a small caravan, only if it's less than 10 oihalim. Or me'asaru l'mayla, once you have 10 tents or more, nichlalim mishe machane, then it becomes a machane, and then you do not need eruv chatzeros. Now, if you notice, the Mishnah Berurah brings down this biur hagra. He gives absolutely no explanation to it. He doesn't give any explanation to it more in the Sha'ar Tzion. I can't tell you that I went through this entire biur halacha clearly to see if he discusses it in the biur halacha. I don't think he does. My memory serves, I don't think he does. But, so the Chavetz Chaim decided to bring down the biur hagra, but he didn't really go into it. If you look at the biur hagra, it seems to be based on a difference of opinion on exactly what the proper girsa, what the proper text is in a Yerushalmi. That there were two opposite versions of the Yerushalmi. The biur hagra is coming off one version of the Yerushalmi. It also seems from the Mefarshim that speak about this biur hagra that the biur hagra is basing himself on a Rashba and a Ritva. And if you look at that Rashba and the Ritva, then when they talk about a machaneh, and they say that a machaneh is potter from eruv chatzeros, it sounds like they're talking about a machaneh that's actually going out to milchama. Now, a machaneh that's going out to war is inherently not kavua, because when you're going out to battle, you have no idea where you're going to be 10 hours from now or 3 hours from now, right? You're attacking, you're under attack, you're constantly on the move, the battlefield is constantly shifting. So it sounds like the machaneh that the biur hagra is talking about, where the biur hagra says, the mechaber says machane chayiv. Biur hagra says machane potter. Yeah, but it could be that the biur hagra is talking about a very specific type of machane. I'm not going to go into that biur hagra any more than that. The Chavetz Chaim didn't seem to want to either. Okay, now we go to the Ramah. Top line in the Shulchan Aruch Reish Lamed Amud Aleph says the Ramah Haga. Botim shabasvina. You have a ship, and the ship has staterooms. So you have a ship. Now let's remember, if you talk about a sizable ship, the interior of the ship is a rishos hayachid, right? The ship has walls. The walls are at least 10 tefachim tall, generally speaking. Good asik bechitzasa, the walls of the sides of the ship extend upward. So the entire ship, even the deck, even above the level of the outside mechitzas, the entire ship is considered to be mukaf mechitzas. Now, if the ship has multiple staterooms, so you could think of this ship kind of as a floating apartment building. Now, what's the status of an apartment building? An apartment building is essentially a big rishos hayachid, and it's a chotzer. And you have a lot of individual homes, individual apartments, inside the chotzer. So this is perfectly ripe for the halacha of eruv chatzeros. So to the ship. the ship is mukaf bechitzos, if it has individual staterooms inside the ship, and you have staterooms that are occupied by Yidden, so if you have at least 2 staterooms that are occupied by Yidden, you now have a chotzer, you have multiple diurin inside the chotzer, presto, you need a ruve chatzeros. So says the Ramah, Haga, batim shabasvina, homes or staterooms that are located inside a ship, tzrichim erev. They need an erev in order to allow transferring from one rishus to the other. Afal pi sheyesh l'svina mechitzos. Even though you might think, you get on the ship and you think, oh, I'm in a big rishus hayachid because the interior of the svina is surrounded by mechitzos. Yeah, it's true, it is a rishus hayachid, but you've got multiple diurin. Since you have multiple diurin, you require iruve chatzeros. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Yud Gimel. Batim, different homes inside the ship, sheshayachim la'anashim miyuchadim, that are designated for individual people. So you've got 5 staterooms, and Ruvain rented out one for a 2-week cruise, Shimon rented out another one for a 2-week cruise, Levi rented out another one for a 2-week cruise. So you've got multiple diurin. Now, I don't want you to walk away from what I just said and paskin halacha l'maisa when it comes to hotels and ships. The shaila is a complex shaila. The reason the shaila is a complex shaila is because, let's say you go on a ship. The ship has furniture in it. The furniture belongs to the owner of the ship. It doesn't belong to the person who's renting the room. Therefore, the owner of the ship has a tfisas yad. He has a certain level of control inside every stateroom. It's very nice that for 2 weeks it's considered your stateroom, but the owner of the ship is allowed to send people into your stateroom whenever he wants. So therefore, it's not necessarily different diurin. It might be one ownership, one dir, and it could be you don't need in Uruv Chatzeres. But I'm going higher level than that just to explain the Ramah. Let's imagine that these are unfurnished rooms. So, okay, you've got a ship, yeah, it's a Rishos HaYachid, but you've got individual staterooms. One is designated for Ruvain, one designated for Shimon, one designated for Levi. So you've got individual entities being served by one larger svina, which is a chotzer. Let's go back into the Mishnah Berurah. Sheshayachim la'anashim miyuchadim. V'atam. And the reason why you need a ruve chatzeros is the loy gara miyoshvei aholim shetzrichid a ruve chatzeros. This is no different than the beginning of Sif Beis. Why does he compare it to the Yoshvei Ohalim? Why doesn't he say the loy gara mi batim b'chotzer? Because you might think that it's not batim in a chotzer. These are not homes in a chotzer. These are more temporary. These are staterooms that I'm in for a short period of time. But yeah, the Mishnah Berurah says, it's similar to the first halach of Sif Beis. It's kind of more temporary. It's kind of more of a diras arai, but since you're in it for an extended period of time, and you're not uprooting it and moving it, right? It's not a shayara, so yeah, you're chayiv in Uruv Chatzeros. Sha'af kan, habatim kfuam lehem, l'chol meshech nisiyasam alayam. You have it for the duration of the cruise. That's an extended period of time. Now you'll ask me, okay, how about a shayara? I'm living in my tent in my caravan for the extended period of the traveling of the shayara. Yeah, but you're moving. You're constantly on the move. Your tent is going to be pitched over here on Tuesday. It's going to be pitched over there on Thursday. Then it's going to be pitched in another place for Shabbos. That's not the case with a ship. You're on the ship and you're staying in that stateroom for an extended period of time. The Magen Avraham El Yerabah remind us that in order for the requirement of a Ruve Chatzeros to kick in, you need multiple Yidden living in separate staterooms in that ship. If the only Yid on the ship is Ruvain, so you've got Ruvain living in one stateroom, and then the other staterooms are occupied by Tony, Vinny, and Vito, well then you don't need a Ruve Chatzeros, because the halach of a Ruve Chatzeros only kicks in if you have multiple Yiddish dwellings. If there's only one stateroom in the ship occupied by a Yid, or there's only one period, the case that the Mishnah Berurah is saying is like this. Let's say the ship has one private stateroom. Ruvain went ahead and rented out the private stateroom. Now there's 10 other Yidden on the ship too, but they weren't able to afford individual staterooms. So they have cots on the deck. So they're living in the open air space of the ship. Essentially, they're living in the chotzer. They're not living in Batim in the Chatzar, they're living in the Chatzar. Well, then you don't need a Eruv Chatzeres. Because Eruv Chatzeres, I mentioned this at the beginning of the year, the requirement of Eruv Chatzeres only kicks in when you have multiple diurim, multiple Batim. So then, Ein Tzarech Erev Klal, Umut Aloitzi Ben Abayis L'Sfina, Vayin Bir Alocha. Ois Kad Yudalid, Tzrichen Erev, Val Yedei Zeh, Yamut L'Taltal, Mibayis L'Bayis, Mibatim L'Sfina. If you make a proper Eruv Chatzeres on the ship, so then you could transfer from one stateroom to the other, and you could transfer from the staterooms to the open areas of the ship, which is the Chatzar. Ubaloy Erev, but if you don't make it Eruv Chatzeres, Aser B'chol Zeh, then everything is going to be aser. You can't go from the staterooms to the ship. You can't go from the ship to the staterooms. Aval b'sfina atzma, but out on the deck of the ship, mutal l'taltal b'kula k'may b'chatzer. Even if you don't make it a Eruv Chatzeres, you could move lawn chairs around on the deck of the ship. That would be like moving lawn chairs around in the Chatzar without an Eruv Chatzeres, as long as those lawn chairs started off Shabbos on the deck and not in one of the staterooms. Similarly, says the Mishnah Berurah, Oisam Sfinos, those ships, She'ein lehem batim, they don't have individual closed-off dwellings. Ela shruyim basfina, you have an open-air boat. People, there are no staterooms. There are no separate dwellings. Hareihem kishruyim b'chatzar achas, so that's like a chatzar without houses, and a bunch of homeless people sleeping in the chatzar. Shemutar l'taltal b'kula b'li'erev, you can move whatever you want, anywhere you want in the chatzar, without making an Eruv Chatzeres. Continues the Ramah, end of the... No. Let's go weiter in the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah is cut Tezvav. The Ramah made the point. He said you need an Erev even though the ship has mechitzos. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut Tezvav. Sheish l'svina mechitzos shal asar tfakim v'dina kurshas hayachid. The point that the Ramah is making is like I spoke out when I read it inside. You might think, well, wait a second. The whole interior of the ship is mukaf bechitzos. Even the deck is mukaf bechitzos. Good asik bechitzasa. So it's all a big rishos hayachid. Why are there any issues of carrying? Yeah, it's all a rishos hayachid. Like the Mishnah Berurah says, sheyesh l'sfina bechitzos shal tfachim v'dina k'rishos hayachid. Yeah, it's a rishos hayachid, but it's serving multiple entities, and therefore you need Eruv Chatzeres. Says the Ramah Vaiter. End of the top line of the Shulchan Aruch. V'im ein l'sfina mechitzos. Now, if the boat doesn't have mechitzos of 10 tfachim at all, let's say you have a very shallow boat, so the boat does not have mechitzos of 10 tfachim. Well, then asal l'taltal b'sfina rak b'arba amos. Well, then you're only allowed to carry up to $1 amos on top of this sfina, because, like the Mishnah Berurah is going to say, the sfina is a carmelis. Remember, the yam is a carmelis. If you have a boat, aka a platform, that's on the yam, if it's dalid al dalid, but it's not mukaf mechitzos, so what is it? It's a carmelis. Well, in a carmelis, you're not allowed to carry more than $1 amos. So if the boat doesn't have mechitzos at all, it's a carmelis. So asal taltal b'sfina rak b'arba amos v'ayin l'kamon soif siman shin pei beis v'siman taf hey siv zayin. Says the Mishnah Berurah. Oiskad tezayin v'im mechitzos, if it doesn't have mechitzos shal asar tfachim, and he reminds us, how do you measure the mechitzos of a boat? Umoidedin mikar ke'isa, we measure from the bottom of the boat. Va'afal pi sheyesh ezet tfachim b'mayim, so if the boat is sitting 5 tfachim below the waterline, you don't count from the waterline and up. You count from the bottom of the interior of the boat. That's where you count the height of the mechitzas from. If it doesn't have mechitzas of 10 tfachim, also l'taltal b'sfina to have your carmelis, because the boat is a carmelis. Mishnah Berurah reminds us, if the boat is going to have a din of a carmelis, then you could transfer freely between the water and the boat and the boat and the water, because carmelis and carmelis, you're allowed to go back and forth from a carmelis to a carmelis. The Magen Avram writes, if a boat does have individual staterooms, and the boat itself doesn't have mechitzay shel asar tvachim, also lahaitzim and abatim l'sfina. You're not allowed to transfer from the individual staterooms onto the boat. Then mirishus hayachid lekarmelis kamapik, because you're going from a rishus hayachid to a karmelis v'ayin bir halacha shevesi oid b'shem Magen Avram. The scenario that the Chavetz Chaim is addressing is a very interesting scenario. Let's say you have a boat. Let's say you have some kind of a flat boat, and it's very shallow. So the boat itself is not mukaf mechitzos. But perched on top of the platform of the boat, you have two huts. So the huts are mukaf mechitzos. The huts are rishus hayachids. The boat outside of the huts is a karmelis. Well, then you can't transfer from the inside of the huts to the boat, or from the boat to the inside of the huts, because you're going between a rishus hayachid and a karmelis. Okay? We're going to stop over here. A little bit of a shorter share today. We'll continue next time with Sif Gimel. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schools of limud HaTorah should be begun on God's Klal Yisrael, the Rebbe Shem Shesen, Yeshua, Refuas, Panasat, Shidduchim, to all those in need. We should be zeicher to see the Biaskal Tzedek. B'meherav Yameinu Amen. Be well.